after specifically the governments of these countries told their people to keep quiet. And people are so angry that they broke the law and demonstrated and opposed the potential American bombing of Iraq. So it will further destabilize the region. Right now, Arab hatred of the United States and Israel is at an all-time high. And frankly, in these conditions, I don't see how a potential for making peace in the Middle East would exist.
One of the problems with the Middle East is the attempt to turn every issue, including this one, into a Israeli issue. And fortunately, our policies are not that narrowly based. The question, of course, no one wanted to attack, no one wanted a military attack. The threat of a military attack is what forced Saddam Hussein to let the inspectors back in. And I think it's the diplomacy backed up by the potential use of force which has gotten us this far and will continue to get us as far as Saddam will let us.
Mr. Johnson, how do you respond to those who believe that it's necessary to remove Saddam Hussein from power?
I think it may well be the only realistic option over the long term. And I mean, when you look at Saddam Hussein's record, it always amazes me that people who claim to be looking out for the interests of the people, including the Iraqi people, somehow ignore, the facts in terms of what Saddam Hussein has done to his own people, to the Kurdish minority, and to many others in a rule which, even by the standards set by other dictators, has been incredibly bloody, brutal, and repressive. And I think for those people who recognize that these are difficult issues, that genuinely want peace in the region, genuinely want people to be better off, one of the realities is, this record that Saddam has as a tremendously repressive dictator, and who has started wars in the region, and in fact has used, these kinds of weapons of mass destruction before.
What do you say to removing Saddam Hussein from power?
The bottom line is that the United States has followed policies, and Britain before it, of always removing regimes that it didn't want. There's nothing new in the United States saying that it's going to replace this regime. The only thing new is that it's taking a long time. As far as brutality, Israel and the United States have brought about more misery and more hardship and more death and destruction of the civilian population in the Middle East than any Arab regime has brought about. Everybody in the Middle East knows it. People in Washington seem to be a bit immune from discussing it. And we happen to be in fact, the anniversary month of Qana, the latest Israeli massacre, which Amnesty International, the UN investigated. The Israelis, with American weapons, by the way, the audacity to lob shells for 15 minutes into a UN base. That's the kind of concern that this country and Israel have for the people of the region.
I think the main problem with removing Saddam Hussein is we don't really know what would follow it. Mm-hmm. So up to now, the calculation has been that it's better to contain him, to keep him in the box, as they say, rather than removing him, which would involve probably keeping the United States troops in Iraq in order to stabilize it afterwards. I think that so far has kept the United States from undertaking that kind of operation, and I think wisely so.
Okay, Mr. Johnson, what were the reasons for the continued sanctions against Iraq following the end of the Gulf War?
Well, there were a number of reasons. One of them had to do with weapons of mass destruction. Another had to do with reparations to Kuwait, which had been invaded. And one of the problems, one of your guests in the previous segment talked about the suffering of the Iraqi people, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. However, what was neglected to be mentioned is that for these period of years in which the sanctions have been enforced, two things. One is Saddam had the option all along since 1991 to have humanitarian relief, okay, and only recently did he elect to take it. Secondly, it's a very amazing thing to see that he's had enough money to continue to build these palaces. I mean, we now have 78 presidential palaces in this country, and to continue to pursue his military power but he has refused to allow the money to pass on to his people, to accept the humanitarian aid that the international community has been willing to give, because he's been trying to make his own people suffer so that somehow he could say to the rest of the world, you see, it's really the United States and the United Nations' fault.
For a country that's killed 1 million children with its sanctions, and for people that have participated in those policies who are sitting on the other side of you, it's amazing to me how they show such concern for the people of Iraq. Anybody who visits the region knows that the people of the region hate the United States for what it's imposing on them.
How do you think the sanctions could be made more humane for the
Sanctions should be lifted. They should be ended immediately. The hypocrisy of the United States is mind-boggling in how we treat Israel, how we treat Saudi Arabia, how we treat the Sheikhdom of Kuwait. Kuwait, by the way, is originally a province of Iraq. It was cut off the map by British imperialism. Again, everybody in the region knows it. How to deal with it now in contemporary history, that's a sub-issue. But the real policy of the United States is divide the regimes, divide the countries, divide the peoples, send in the CIA, use sanctions, use military force, and sooner or later, the people of the region will respond to that, as they have in Iran.
How long do you think that these sanctions should be in place?
Until Iraq meets the terms of the UN resolutions that impose them. The war ended with a ceasefire. Certain conditions were placed on Iraq. They agreed to those conditions. If they meet those conditions, the sanctions will be lifted. They haven't, and it's not the United States, it is the United Nations. And the fact is that the United Nations has held firm with this policy for 6.5 years now, and until he meets the terms of those resolutions, the sanctions will stay on.
Okay. I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for this segment. We have to pause right now for one last public service announcement. But when we come back, we'll be joined by our guests once again to discuss weapons of mass destruction. So stay tuned for more Shades of Grey. Welcome back to the April 6th edition of Shades of Grey. I'm your host, Ronald Holsey. Tonight we're discussing the crisis in Iraq. The threat of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq has caused a scare in much of the American public. Despite this, many still fear that the military action that the United States may implement could only aggravate the situation further. Producer Michael Heller went to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. to find out more.
In Washington today, tensions are high as the situation in the Middle East remains uncertain. Though Saddam Hussein has agreed to UN weapons inspections, many experts worry that Iraq may have more weapons technology than the U.S. is aware of. Steve Daly of the Nuclear Control Institute worries that Saddam Hussein may possess biological and even nuclear weapons far beyond the knowledge of UN inspectors.
Well, I think part of the problem is no one except Saddam and his henchmen know for sure exactly how close they are to nuclear weapons. It's pretty clear, at least according to the UN Special Commission, that they have a number of chemical and particularly biological weapons that are already in artillery shells and in missile shells, and that's what the inspectors are looking for most immediately. But as to whether Iraq actually has a nuclear weapon or just has the know-how to put one together, or even is a bit short of that, is not clear. That's why the inspections and the interviews need to continue to move forward.
We went to Capitol Hill to find out how Americans feel about the way in which the U.S. government has handled the situation in Iraq since the Gulf War.
It would have been nice had we finished the job in the first place, I think. When we were at war, I think maybe we backed off, but I think the way things are now, I think they're handling it as well as possible. It's a really complicated problem, and I don't think there are any simple solutions.
I'm kind of tired of everybody saying, why didn't we just take care of it the first time? But that's not how it works. So, and even if we go in this time, we won't oust them. So, right now, I'm pretty pleased with how it's going. I mean, it takes time. So.
I think that there are men that are truly evil, and I think that Saddam has proven by his career of terrorizing and hurting and killing his own people and his neighbors, that he fits into that category. He is truly a power monger who is not interested in the quality of life for the people in his own country or the countries that are surrounding him.
Diplomatic relations could be, they're a little harsh on Saddam. I believe that chemical weapons are a threat. However, I just feel that by threatening with military force is just not the way to go. I think there are many other solutions, and I think I am glad that we were able to come to a diplomatic accord of some sort, and I hope that future relations can improve and become better.
As many American troops remain stationed in the Middle East, White House officials will continue to keep an increasingly keen eye on the area and on Saddam Hussein in coming months. For WBNC, this is Michael Heller reporting.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to once again introduce my four guests, starting on my far left. From the University of California at Davis is Mr. Bruce Jenelson. Next to him on my left is Chris Madison from the U.S. Senate. On my far right is Mark Brzezinski from the Committee on the Middle East, and Mr. Omar Kura on my right from the Committee on the Middle East as well. Thank you all heartily very much for being here. I'd also like to once again remind our viewers at home that our phone lines are open for questions or commentary, so dial in 301-650-6472. We look forward to your call, as always. I'd like to ask this question to Mr. Brzezinski. Why might Saddam Hussein have refused weapons inspections?
For the same reason the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Saudis, and everybody else in the world refuses weapons inspections. This is an armed world. There are many parties in the Middle East, much better armed than Iraq is today, who are opposed to Iraq policies. The idea, it's almost unbelievable, the idea that the Americans can decide who in this world can arm, who in this world must disarm. We can decide who in the UN will pay its dues, who in the UN won't pay its dues. We can decide which countries have to obey Security Council resolutions, which countries don't have to obey Security Council resolutions. We have two other gentlemen here who have all tonight harped on Security Council resolutions and international law, but the greatest violator of Security Council resolutions and international law, by far, is the very country we provide $4 billion in economic and military aid to every year, and then they don't want to discuss the influence and the power of the Israeli Jewish lobby in Washington. Such disingenuousness and such deceitfulness is what gets the American public into so much trouble in trying to understand what's really going on in the Middle East.
Indeed, for example, resolutions 242 and 338, which call on Israel to withdraw from Arab territories occupied in 1967, have not been implemented yet. And while we forced Iraq to leave Kuwait in less than 8 months, we continue to finance Israel's occupation by giving it arms and excusing it from international condemnation in the Security Council by vetoing any resolution that might upset the Israelis.
Okay.
I have a good idea, Ron. I think that next time you ought to schedule a Shades of Gray on the influence of Israel on U.S. politics, and then you can have Mr. Brzezinski on to discuss that.
I accept.
Because he would much rather talk about that.
Because that's a very important part of what we're talking about tonight.
Why do you feel Saddam Hussein may want to develop weapons of mass destruction and not let inspections take place?
Well, I think Mr. Brzezinski is right. A lot of people have weapons. And Saddam Hussein not only has weapons, he has used weapons. And part of the whole point of the UN Security Council resolutions is to get him to not use the weapons after he used them in the Persian Gulf War and other times. It's that simple. I mean, Israel has not used chemical weapons. Israel has not used nuclear weapons. The United States has not used nuclear weapons. If you use them, what we're essentially saying here is you lose them.
Why would you feel Saddam Hussein may want to develop these types of weapons?
Well, look at Saddam's neighbors. They're all arming up, and there's a lot of tension in the region. And if you're somebody surrounded by enemies, you would want to develop arms also. This is not exactly a perfect world where everybody obeys resolutions and live peacefully side by side. It's a matter of power, and those who acquire that power will get to lay down the rules.
Okay. Mr. Johnson, could you tell us maybe some of the effects that differ between conventional weapons and chemical weapons?
Well, the category of weapons of mass destruction, includes chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. And it's called that, WMD is the acronym people tend to use because of the tremendous amount of destruction that these weapons can inflict. Now, mind you, conventional weapons, we're not talking about, small rifles. We're talking about, very sophisticated weapons as well. But they are fundamentally, qualitatively of a different kind. And so, particularly when you combine that, not just the capabilities, but with the demonstrated intentions that have been shown, unfortunately, time and time again, by Saddam Hussein, the willingness to use these weapons, again, not only against other countries, but against his own people, it makes it that much greater a threat than any other situation that exists in the world.
Could you possibly explain the Geneva Protocol of 1925?
Well, the Geneva Protocol of 1925 dealt specifically with chemical weapons, okay? And Saddam has violated that time and time again by his use of that. We also have a new treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, that is an effort, to ban chemical weapons from any country currently that possesses them today. There have also been efforts to have international treaties on biological weapons. Unfortunately, you also need, the methods of enforcement. And when the UN set up the inspections regime for Saddam, which truly was unprecedented, and the UN doesn't take lightly these things about, going inside another country. Right. It was because so much cause had been shown by his actions that it was felt necessary to take steps that had never been taken before against any other country.
Would you say that in light of the violations of the Geneva Protocol, do you think that the U.S. or the UN is justified in maybe wanting to inspect weapons in Iraq? Or?
Why don't we have weapons throughout the world being inspected? How come our facilities are not open? In fact, the U.S. has violated many of the same things when it comes to who can be on the inspection teams by telling the UN who could be on inspection teams. The level of disingenuousness and hypocrisy in this debate tonight is practically mind-boggling. And I invite the listeners, it's a modern age, I invite them to come to our website, www.middleeast.org. We've got lots of information. We have a full list of who's on the advisory committee of the Committee on the Middle East, bios of the people involved, and lots of discussion about what we think to be the realities of the situation that we face in the Middle East and that we face here in Washington.
Kind of reminds me of Jerry Brown during one of the recent presidential campaigns.
Thank you. I think Jerry Brown's a very interesting person.
Okay. How was Iraq reprimanded for using chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War? And were they reprimanded? And if so, was this justified?
Well, one of the most important investigations of that came from, in fact, the United States Senate. A team led by Senate staffers, reputable people, went over there and produced very shocking kinds of evidence of what Saddam had done against the Kurdish people in regions of his country. And I think if there's one thing that's been said over there that I agree with, was that the U.S. relationship with Saddam, in fact I invite you to read my book on this, in the period leading up to the Gulf War, was very much one in which we were blinded by, our belief that Iran, there was no way that you could ever coexist with Iran, and so we embraced the other side, consistent with this notion of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But there were critics of that policy at that time who unfortunately weren't listened to, and it did take, the invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990 for it to be fully realized by the administration that was in power then what we really were dealing with in terms of Saddam.
I mean, one of the things that's going on here is now that the Soviet Union has dissolved and there is no superpower relationship that's defining our foreign policy or anyone else's, we're trying to look for other threats that exist to our security and the security of our allies in Europe and elsewhere. And the weapons of mass destruction is the one thing that we see that exists in lots of different places. And so what you have are a series of treaties and protocols where we're trying to get some means to control these weapons and to limit their development and to try and keep them from being used. And that's part of what this whole UN Security Council fight with Iraq is over, but it's also behind the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The focus in the American foreign policy in the next few years, or the next few decades, will be on this: how do we get a handle on these weapons? And one way is what we're doing with Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, Ron, if I could add to that. I think what has just been said is very important. The trouble is it hasn't been put in the right context. We have a huge military-industrial complex in this country. After the end of the Cold War, that complex was searching desperately for some way to keep itself in power. It has now found it: Islamic fundamentalism and weapons of mass destruction. The fact that we sold them the anthrax, the fact that we sold them the chemical weapons, somehow gets overlooked in the debate. The fact that our allies are armed to the teeth with these things somehow gets overlooked in the debate. And the American people are told, we now have these other threats, and for that reason the Pentagon budget has to keep going up, the research and development budget has to keep going up, and gentlemen such as this have to keep going on their junkets and going to their State Department assignments. It's a scam perpetrated on the American people when these resources should be used in far better ways for the development of our own country, where we have plenty of problems of our own.
Mr. Kuro, how do you think that the United States could prevent Iraq from using chemical warfare?
Well, the United States should implement an arms control over all the countries of the region, beginning with Israel, and then you could send it, Israel and the other Arab countries. It's not only Saddam involved here, it's all the countries of the region arming up, and with tensions rising, that could give a way for more violence and war to happen in the region.
What do you think? Should the United States also put the same kind of restrictions on Israel and other countries in the area, or why or why not?
Well, I mean, you're asking about the chemical, you're asking about a country that has used weapons of mass destruction time and time again. And I think that when you're dealing with Iraq, this notion of moral equivalence between other countries is a very, specious and superficial argument, that just doesn't really hold any water. When you try to look at these issues, in fact, consistent with the title of your program, not so much in terms of black and white and accusing one side of somehow all sorts of, personal indiscretions and being this, that, and the other thing. You look for the shades of gray. These are very difficult issues, and I think the best way to approach them, is in a serious dialogue that unfortunately I don't think has been reciprocated tonight. But when you get at the shades of gray, then you have the real tough issues that we as people have to deal with.
And with that, I'm sorry, but that's a great ending, and I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have for this month's edition of Shades of Gray. I'd like to once again thank all of my guests very much for being here. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Before we go, I'd like to...
I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East, and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.